Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. My name is Dan Attridge, and as many of you know, I'm the Dean of the Law School. Today's lecture is part of our Brendan Brown lecture series, which began at our law school in 1982. Brendan Brown was the sixth dean of our school. He was an internationally recognized legal scholar who also played a key role in the administration of the Japanese war crimes trials following World War II. The Brendan Brown Lecture Series invites outstanding professionals from various fields who have made a contribution to public life to share their perspectives on a wide variety of current topics. On the back page of your program, you will find a listing of speakers who have addressed us as part of the series in previous years. Our speaker today is Governor Jerome H. Powell. Since 2012, Mr. Powell has been serving as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He was originally nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate to fill an unexpired term. And in 2014, he was again nominated and confirmed for a full 14-year term expiring in 2028. Before joining the Federal Reserve Board, Governor Powell had a distinguished career in the public and private sectors. He was a visiting scholar at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a partner at the Carlyle Group, an assistant secretary and undersecretary at the Department of Treasury, an investment banker, and yes, students, a lawyer. Governor Powell received his AB degree from Princeton and his JD degree from Georgetown, where he and I were classmates and became good friends. Quite apart from our friendship, the governor has an even more significant connection to our law school. His grandfather, James J. Hayden, served as the dean and a professor at our Columbus School of Law. Governor Powell will be speaking today on the topic of the Federal Reserve and the financial crisis. I think you will find this topic of great interest in light of the ongoing debate about the role of the Federal Reserve as an independent federal agency in our political system and in our economy. Please join me in welcoming Governor Powell.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here today. It's great to see you and Missy. We were very close friends many years ago and ever since, and raised our kids together, so it's a real pleasure to be here. And I almost feel like I never left the law behind. I'm back here, pleading my case. And it's a particular pleasure and honor for me to be here today as a guest of this institution. As Dan mentioned, I'm very proud to say that my grandfather, James J. Hayden, he earned his doctorate of law from Catholic University and later served as dean, I think from 1935 to 1937 and then 1941 to 1953. And a picture of him is up on the wall. James J. Hayden was an early scholar of the regulation that was prompted by a game-changing technological innovation, aviation. He was, in that sense, someone who looked to the future and wanted to be part of it. In his years leading the law school, I hope that he could also glimpse the great institution that this law school would become. And I'm also very happy to be joined by his son, Dunstan, my uncle, in the orange sweater and the white hair, who taught Dan in high school. So it's very incestuous here today. So it's been a little more than 6 years since the fall of 2008 when the peak of a severe financial crisis presented the very real threat of a second Great Depression. And the damage was extensive, and for some time the recovery was frustratingly slow. But the economy has improved considerably over the past 2 years, and I am optimistic that this improvement will continue. The financial system is also stronger and more resilient after improvements in regulation and oversight by the Federal Reserve and other agencies, and also better management by banks and other financial firms. The Fed acted boldly during and after the financial crisis in the face of great uncertainty, and the full effects of these policies will become clear only with the passage of time. Indeed, the Federal Reserve's role in the Great Depression of the 1930s is still actively debated. That said, as I will show, the evidence as of today is very strong that the Fed's actions generally succeeded and are a major reason why the U.S. economy is now outperforming that of other advanced nations. Other central banks are now embracing some of the same bold steps undertaken much earlier by the Fed. So against this background, I am concerned about several troubling proposals that would subject monetary policy to undue political pressure and place new limits on the Fed's ability to respond to future crises. And my remarks will address three of these proposals. The first goes by the somewhat misleading name of Audit the Fed and would subject the Federal Reserve's conduct of monetary policy to unlimited congressional policy reviews, which are not to be confused with financial audits, which are already conducted regularly. The second is a proposal to require the Fed to adopt and follow a specific equation in setting monetary policy and to face immediate congressional hearings and an investigation by the GAO whenever it deviates from that policy equation. Third, there are discussions about imposing new limitations on the Fed's long-held powers to provide liquidity in a crisis, and I'll get into each of these in some detail. I think these proposals are misguided for three important reasons. First, they're motivated by the belief that the Fed's response during the crisis was both ineffective and outside the bounds of its traditional role and responsibilities. In fact, the Fed's actions were effective, necessary, appropriate, and very much in keeping with the traditional role of the Fed and other central banks around the world. Second, these proposals are based on the assertion that the Federal Reserve operates in secrecy and was not accountable for its actions during the crisis, a perspective that is in violent conflict with the facts. The Fed has been transparent, accountable, and subject to extensive oversight, especially during and since the crisis. And we've also taken appropriate steps since the crisis to further enhance that transparency. I wonder if I could get a glass of water somehow. There it is. That was quick. You're good. Third, and most importantly, I believe these proposals fail to anticipate the significant costs and risks of subjecting monetary policy to political pressure and constraining the Fed's ability to carry out its traditional role of providing liquidity in a crisis. So I say that the Fed's policies were appropriate and effective. Let me talk about that. There's no dispute, I think, that the Fed's actions after the onset of the financial crisis were unprecedented in scale and scope. To help stabilize the financial system and keep credit flowing to households and businesses, the Fed lent to banks through the discount window and to financial institutions and markets through numerous broad-based lending facilities using emergency lending authority granted by Congress during the Great Depression. In a limited number of cases, the Fed also extended liquidity support to individual institutions whose imminent failure threatened to bring down the global financial system. At the same time, the Fed used monetary policy to help stabilize the economy. After cutting our target rate for the overnight interest rate on loans between banks, which is our usual monetary policy tool, as low as it could go, the Fed took further action using unconventional policy tools. These policies involved communication, providing forward guidance that the FOMC expected to keep rates low for longer than had been expected, and also purchasing large amounts of longer-term Treasury debt and other securities to put downward pressure on long-term rates and support the economy. While these actions were extraordinary and in some cases unprecedented, they were taken because the threats posed by the crisis were also without precedent. For the first time, cutting the Fed's policy rate to near zero proved insufficient to halt a plummeting economy, so the Fed took further action. For the first time since the Great Depression, our nation faced a financial panic so severe that the Fed's normal overnight lending to banks was not enough. So the Fed did more, using congressionally granted powers it had held but not used since the 1930s and that were intended to deal with just such rare emergencies. So as Congress considers proposals that will affect the conduct of monetary policy and the Fed's ability to respond in a crisis, I think it's important to recognize how effective the response to the crisis was. With respect to monetary policy, the unconventional policies were designed to stimulate the economy in the same way as traditional monetary policy by lowering interest rates, which generally supports economic activity. And these actions delivered a highly accommodative policy which was essential given the depth of the recession. Without these steps, the slump in the labor market and the broader economy surely would have been deeper and more prolonged, and the low wage and price inflation we are still experiencing might have turned into outright deflation. Critics warned that these policies would unleash uncontrollable inflation, fail to stimulate demand, and court other known and unknown risks. Indeed, after I joined the Federal Reserve Board in May 2012, I too expressed doubts about the efficacy and risks of further asset purchases. I was not alone in that. But at some point, let's let the data speak. The evidence so far is clear that these policies have had substantial benefits and that the risks have not materialized. Inflation, for example, has continued to run well below the committee's 2% objective. Indeed, those who argue today that the committee should hold off from raising interest rates are citing low inflation as the main cause, the main justification for doing so. As I noted at the outset, due in part to the Fed's effective response to the crisis, the United States recovery has been stronger than that of other advanced economies with faster job creation, lower unemployment, and faster growth. And that is one reason why a number of central banks around the world have adopted forward guidance and asset purchase programs similar to the Fed's policies. The Fed's lending policies in the crisis were also successful. There's little dispute today that the crisis threatened a global financial collapse and depression, and that these liquidity policies were instrumental in arresting the crisis. Warnings about the Fed's lending in the crisis have also not been borne out. Critics claimed that the Fed had been reckless, throwing money ineffectively at problems and making loans to uncreditworthy borrowers. On the contrary, the Fed's lending was targeted to institutions, markets, and sectors that proved central to arresting the crisis. Loans were extended based on the same terms that the Fed had always applied. Borrowers must be solvent, the loans have to be secured, and an appropriate interest rate has to be charged. As a result, every single loan that the Fed made during the crisis has been repaid in full, on time, and with interest. Traditional oversight of the Federal Reserve has been both extensive and effective. Like other parts of our democratic system of government, the Fed must be accountable to the public and its elected representatives. And frankly, given the scale of our actions during the crisis, it has been not only appropriate, but essential that these actions be transparent to the public and subject to close and careful scrutiny by Congress. And that's exactly what happened. So it's jarring, and that I would say is the polite term, to hear it asserted that the Fed carries out its duties in secret and is unaccountable to the public and its elected representatives. The Federal Reserve is highly transparent and accountable to the public and to Congress. First, the Fed doesn't set its own goals for monetary policy. Congress assigned us the goals of price stability and maximum employment, which is the highest level of employment that can be achieved without threatening inflation. Federal Reserve Board members are nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. The chair of the Fed makes a report to Congress twice a year and appears before both the House and Senate oversight committees to report on monetary policy and in practice to answer questions about anything and everything that the Fed does. The chair and other board members such as myself also appear regularly before Congress and meet frequently in private with members of the House and Senate. More generally, our operations are open and transparent, including those related to monetary policy. We account for ourselves in timely post-meeting FOMC statements, highly detailed minutes, televised press conferences, and endless speeches. Details about the Fed's balance sheet are on the public record. In fact, every security owned by the Fed is identified individually on the website of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Fed's plans to normalize the balance sheet have been the subject of exhaustive discussion in the FOMC as reflected in the minutes, in speeches by policymakers, and among the many journalists and academics who analyze and discuss Fed policies. Last September, the FOMC published its normalization principles, which set forth its plans to reduce the balance sheet to a more normal level over time. We often hear that there's no transparency about the balance sheet. I don't know what else there would be to put out there, frankly. The Fed's financial statements are also a matter of public record and are audited annually by independent outside auditors under the watchful eye of our own Inspector General. And I am well aware of this because I happen to chair the committees that have oversight responsibility for the audits of both the Federal Reserve Board and all the reserve banks. I can tell you that I worked for many years in the financial markets, and the Fed's financial statements, although they contain a lot of zeros, a lot of big numbers, are actually relatively straightforward. In fact, they're much simpler than that of a typical regional bank. We have a very simple business model, and our financial statements are really pretty vanilla. The Fed's operations, including its role regulating and supervising banks, are subject to extensive review by the General Accounting Office. If you visit the GAO's website, you'll find more than 70 reports since the crisis that are wholly or partly dedicated to reviewing our operations, including the emergency lending facilities I mentioned a few moments ago. The GAO also works closely with our Inspector General, which is involved in both financial audits and oversight of our other operations. So the extensive oversight I described intensified, and appropriately so, as the Fed responded to the financial crisis. Our lending facilities were also the subject of review by the Fed's Inspector General, the Special Inspector General for TARP, the Congressional Oversight Panel, the Financial Crisis Inquiry Committee, and numerous other congressional hearings and reviews. And our actions were fully transparent. As always, monetary policy decisions were debated and voted upon and announced immediately with detailed explanations, very detailed explanations provided in the minutes. The Fed provided public guidance on our asset purchase plans and made those purchases in open, competitive transactions that were disclosed as they occurred. The terms and conditions for every lending facility were publicly disclosed. The amounts lent under each program were published on our weekly balance sheet. We created a website, issued a monthly report to Congress disclosing details on all loans, like the quantity and quality of the collateral posted by borrowers. So let me turn to the costs of these proposals. As I said at the outset, I believe that these proposals fail to anticipate the significant costs and risks of subjecting the Fed's conduct of monetary policy to political pressure and of limiting the ability of the Fed to execute its traditional role of keeping credit flowing to American households and businesses in a financial crisis. And I'll first address Audit the Fed, which would repeal a narrow but critical exemption adopted by Congress in 1978 to limit GAO policy reviews of the conduct of monetary policy. Congress granted this exemption because the costs of involving the GAO in monetary policy making, including the substantial risk of political interference, far outweigh the potential benefits. Now, I want to stress again that it's important to note that the GAO investigations are not the financial audits that many assume them to be. They extend beyond mere accounting to examine strategy, judgments, and day-to-day decision-making. Indeed, by statute, the GAO is charged with making recommendations to Congress about the areas they reviewed. This could put the GAO in the position of reviewing monetary policy decisions and recommending its own course for monetary policy. So with that background, the potential benefits of these policy audits would be small, even before considering their potential costs. Unlike the programs that are typically subject to GAO review, such as procurement decisions that might be brought to light only by the GAO's attention, monetary policy decisions occur with all the world watching. They're announced immediately, described in an FOMC statement, often elaborated upon in a press conference, and are the subject of endless same-day analysis and debate. With all of that transparency and analysis, very little would be revealed by a GAO policy audit that would help evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy. Indeed, the effects of monetary policy are felt typically with a considerable time lag, and often only years later, which would further reduce an estimate of those benefits. On the cost side, Audit the Fed also risks inserting Congress directly into monetary policy decision-making, reversing decades of deliberate effort by Congress to insulate the Fed from political pressure in carrying out its day-to-day duties. Indeed, some advocates of the bill have expressed support for complete elimination of the Federal Reserve. Long experience in the United States and other advanced economies has shown that monetary policy is most successful when decisions are rendered independent of influence by elected officials. As recent U.S. history has shown, elected officials have often pushed for easier policies that serve short-term political interests at the expense of higher inflation and damage to the long-term health and stability of the economy. After World War II, and as recently as the early 1970s, political pressures likely influenced Federal Reserve decision-making in a way that helped cause excessive inflation and related bouts of economic weakness. Some of us are old enough to remember this. In 1977, as what came to be called the Great Inflation neared its peak, Congress passed legislation that spelled out the goals for monetary policy: maximum employment, stable prices, but left it to the Fed to precisely define those goals and the means by which they would be achieved. To preserve the Fed's independence in implementing policy to reach those goals, Congress exempted monetary policy from the GAO investigations it was then authorizing for all other Fed operations. This independence has served the nation very well. Over the 20 years or so before the crisis, the Fed was able to maintain low and stable inflation, and recessions were brief and mild. And I've dropped one chart here, which, if those of you who have a paper copy, shows the performance of inflation. And what you see is that beginning in the late 70s, inflation has come steadily down and has been low and under control for more than 30 years now. And that's not to say the Fed got everything right during this period, far from it, but it does seem to me that any pre-crisis shortcomings were in regulation and supervision by the Fed and other agencies rather than in monetary policy. There are also other costs from subjecting monetary policy to GAO investigations. Frequent investigations of that nature would likely inhibit debate and the flow of information and ideas at FOMC meetings among staff and policymakers, which would lead to poorer decisions. Market participants would have to wonder whether the FOMC would react to GAO criticism, and they could lose confidence in the Fed's independence, reducing the Fed's credibility. To those who may doubt that GAO investigations would be used by Congress to try to influence monetary policy, let me briefly describe another proposal which envisions exactly that. This bill would require the FOMC to carry out monetary policy according to a simple equation and require immediate congressional hearings and a GAO audit whenever monetary policy deviates from this equation. Simple policy rules of this nature are used widely by the FOMC and by central banks around the world as a guide to policy. They're highly useful. But no central bank applies them in such a mechanical fashion, and there is very little support among economists for doing so. And I would add, based on my own experience in business, in government service, and in life, I really doubt that important decisions can be reduced ultimately to such a small equation that contains three variables. The most you might get out of such a rule is to get at most 80% of the way there, and it's that last 20% that makes all the difference. Finally, there's been discussion in Congress of imposing new restrictions on the ability of the Fed to respond as it did with liquidity facilities during the financial crisis. Although I'm not aware of a specific bill at this point, the idea is to limit the Fed's authority under the Federal Reserve Act, Section 13.3, under which we're empowered to lend in unusual and exigent circumstances. And this is the emergency lending authority that we use in the face of the system-wide panic that threatened the financial system. So as the crisis receded, Congress took two related actions. First, it gave regulators what they had badly needed during the crisis, which is a means for resolving the largest financial institutions when they fail, if they fail, without threatening the financial system. Second, Congress then prohibited emergency loans to individual firms, but retained the Fed's ability to establish broadly available lending programs with the prior approval of the Secretary of the Treasury and timely notification to Congress. So that trade-off was made after extensive consultation between Congress and the Federal Reserve, and I believe that it struck a reasonable balance. I also believe it would be a mistake to go further and impose additional restrictions. One of the lessons of the crisis is that the financial system evolves so quickly that it's difficult to predict where threats will emerge and what actions may be needed in the future to respond. Because we can't anticipate what may be needed in the future, Congress should preserve the ability of the Fed to respond flexibly and nimbly to future emergencies. Further restricting or eliminating the Fed's emergency lending authority will not prevent future crises. It will not, but it will hinder the Fed's ability to limit the harm from those crises for families and businesses. So to wrap up, in our democratic system, the Federal Reserve owes the public and Congress a high degree of transparency and accountability. Congress has wisely given the Fed the tools it needs to implement monetary policy and respond to future crises, as well as crucial independence to do its work free from short-term political influence. I urge caution regarding current proposals that threaten just such political influence and place restrictions on the very tools that so recently proved essential in preventing a new depression. Congressional oversight of the Federal Reserve, including its conduct of monetary policy, is extensive, but no doubt could be improved in ways that don't threaten the Fed's effectiveness. And I would welcome discussions with Congress about ways to aid in its important oversight of monetary policy. There may be differing views of how Congress can carry out those responsibilities in the best way, but there can be no disagreement about the purpose of that oversight, which is to help the Fed succeed in promoting a healthy economy and a strong and stable financial system. Those are the goals Congress assigned the Fed a century ago, and I'm optimistic that Congress and the Fed will continue to work together to pursue them on behalf of the American people. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take a few questions. Thanks.
So we have a limited amount of time for questions, so let me set a few ground rules. Governor Powell would like to take 3 questions at a time, and then he can respond to all 3 of them at once. We want your questions to be obviously clear and concise. This isn't an opportunity to make a speech. It's an opportunity to ask a question. We'd like you to state your name and your affiliation. So John Doe, Mary Smith, first-year student. And then what we'd like to do, because this is an educational event, first and foremost, we're going to give priority in the first round to any students or faculty who might have a question. And in the second round, I know the members of the press here will let you have an opportunity in the second round. So if that's understood, any students or faculty have a question, again, just give me your question. We'll take 3 at a time, and then the governor will take all 3 at once. Yes, Professor Schooner.
Hi, Governor Powell. Thank you so much for coming to share with us your thoughts about the Federal Reserve. You want me to take this?
Take the microphone.
Heidi Schooner on the faculty of Catholic University. You mentioned the Fed's statutory mandate a couple of times of price stability and full employment. I'm just curious what you think of some proposals that central banks be given a mandate of reducing systemic risk, whether that's a good idea, helpful, how that would assist central banks in dealing with future crises.
Okay, thank you for the question. Do we have another question? Are you a student or faculty member? Okay. I don't recognize you. Are you an adjunct?
I'm new. I'm full-time at the business, I teach finance in the business school. My name is Lou Anzurlo, former career on Wall Street. I have a question about the capital adequacy rules, whether you think this latest bumbling about the strong dollar making them unfair for a couple of the large U.S.-centered banks is fair, and whether they are going to be pushed back.
Okay, do we have thank you. Do we have a student with a question? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Niket Patel, third-year evening student, and this may sound like a dumb question, but what exactly does like the Federal Reserve do? Because I mean, I hear that's the central bank, but like, I don't know. When I go to a local bank, I deposit money and whatnot, but I don't know, how does the Federal Reserve fit into all that? So, just basic question.
Okay. So first, Heidi. Heidi and I met at the conference in St. Louis for small banks, whenever that was, 6 months ago or so. So in terms of, the question was, should we have a tripartite mandate, which includes financial stability as well as stable prices and full employment? And you know, first of all, we'll do whatever mandate Congress gives us. The reality is that financial stability has been part of the Fed's role since the very beginning, and it's really at the heart of what central banks do. You know, banking systems have been for centuries prone to panics because of the nature of banking and the sort of lack of transparency. A depositor thinks that their deposit is money, but it's really a loan to a bank, and then there's a run, and central banks have had that role. So I don't really think it's necessary to add it as a part of the mandate, but I think of it as a critical, essential thing that we have to have in order to produce stable prices and full employment. You asked about the rule. So this is a fairly technical issue, a very technical issue, if I may say so. You must have done this in the private sector. So we have proposed very high, if I may say, risk-based capital standards for the largest firms, just for the very largest firms. And there's a technical issue that it's associated with the strong dollar, and it's the subject of an active rulemaking, so I'm not going to be able to provide you any guidance on what we're going to do about that, but issues have been raised about the appropriate, whether that particular aspect of it is appropriate. I can't really respond to that because that's the subject of comment in this rule. But I will say that the point of the higher capital standards for the largest institutions is really to make sure that they internalize the costs of their potential failure. It's a macroprudential tool, and that's really the idea, is that if they fail, given their failure, the costs would be X, and we try to cause them to have higher capital to account for that. And it does create incentives to not be so big unless you really feel you need to. Thirdly, what does the central bank do? Great question. Great question. So the first thing, let me talk about interest rates. So central banks have essentially no role in deciding what the potential output of the country is. So the country has people, it has technology, it's got factories, it's got computers, it's got education, and all of that sort of sets the potential output for the country. And monetary policy doesn't really address that. What monetary policy does is when there's a shock to the economy and the economy weakens, we lower interest rates. Lower interest rates support economic activity through fairly well understood channels. People can borrow cheaper, their floating rate debt is cheaper, businesses can invest because their cost of capital is lower, the cost of your mortgage goes down, all that kind of thing. So we lower rates when the economy weakens. When the economy gets stronger and stronger and stronger, what happens when an economy runs up against resource constraints where it's really, there's no one else to hire? What happens when there's no one else to hire is you start bidding for workers, and the economy overheats and you get inflation. So what we try to do is, as the economy strengthens, we try to raise interest rates. And Congress has given us really two mandates, one of which is stable prices, which means 2% inflation. We want 2% inflation over a period of time. It's never going to be exactly 2% except briefly. And also full employment, such a level of employment as doesn't cause inflation. Somebody asked about the single mandate too. Didn't someone? No, maybe not. Yes, didn't somebody ask about? No, you went to financial stability. I thought you were going to the single mandate. You were going to a tripartite mandate. So we'll take three more.
Okay, next round, and I promise the press will take your questions from the press. You couldn't state your name. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Howard Schneider with Reuters. Governor Powell, just curious about your read on U.S. labor markets right now. Whether you see where you see the level of slack and how tight they're getting. What do you make of the weak wages? Whether you think NAIRU's down.
Sorry, what was the last part?
Whether you think the level of the natural rate of unemployment is
okay.
dropping, as some suspect.
Okay.
Thank you. Kate Davidson, Wall Street Journal. Governor Powell, could you talk about, did you coordinate with Chair Yellen on your speech? Did she read it? Did she endorse it as well? Or is this coming more from you directly?
Okay, one more. Anyone else from the press? Okay. Then any other faculty or staff? Or are you faculty or staff?
My name is Gerard Schultz, and I'm a common citizen.
Okay, Mr. Schultz,
I'm-
let someone else have a chance.
Oh, someone else have a chance? I don't count?
You're going to have a chance in the next round if we have time. This is an educational event. We should all Okay. I apologize. We'll see if we have time in the next round. Any other students or faculty?
Thank you. Hi, Billy Barnes, first-year student here at Catholic. First-year student here at Catholic. Just wondering about these criticisms of the Federal Reserve that you're defending against. When did they begin, and what reasoning do they have?
Okay. So in terms of the U.S. labor market, the U.S. economy is coming off of two pretty good years. We've had growth of 2.5% to 3% in 2013 and 2014. Job creation has been strong, averaging over 200,000 in 2013 and 260,000 now in 2014. 2014 was the highest level of job creation since, I think, 1999. And there's been a marked strengthening in the back half of 14 and the beginning of 13. So you see quite a lot of job creation. And it really does feel to be at a sustainable level, just month after month after month. You asked about slack. So I guess unemployment is 5.7% right now. Many estimates of the natural rate are in natural rate, which is the rate at which sort of full employment exists, or you could think of it as the rate at which inflation would begin to accelerate, are in the 5.2 to 5.5 range. And So I would say that the 5.7 underestimates the amount of slack in the economy. This is labor resources that are not being utilized, and it appears in a couple of places. There are something like 7 million people now who are working part-time for economic reasons, who want full-time jobs. In other words, they're working part-time. So they're worth about a half a person if they work 23 hours a week, roughly. They want full-time jobs, so there's some slack there. In addition, labor force participation really plummeted during the crisis. It went down by what in economics is quite a large amount. And we believe, and economists generally believe, that some portion of that decline is cyclical in the sense that there are people who are not currently listed as being in the workforce, but who want to be in the workforce. You don't count as unemployed if you're not in the workforce, right? So if you actually come in the workforce, you might drive unemployment up. So there's slack out there. There's also a lot of long-term unemployed. You asked a good question about the natural rate. So I am thinking, and I think many people, if you read economists around the world, people are now thinking that maybe the natural rate is lower than 5.2%, that it's 5 or even lower than that. And the reason is because wage inflation, ordinarily when you get near full employment, you start to see employers bidding for employees, and you see wages go up. So wage inflation has been well below the level that would be consistent with 2% price inflation. In theory, you should earn inflation plus productivity gains, which should be 3.5% growth in wages, would be consistent with 2% price inflation. And we have now instead about 2%. So very little in the way of real wage gains, far less in productivity. So that's suggestive of more slack in the economy. So, Kate, I volunteered for this. I feel very strongly about these issues, and I put myself forward. I'm not going to talk about our internal clearance process, but in fact, I don't have to undergo any clearance, but I do. I'd be crazy not to. There are lots of people like Dave Skidmore here who helps me out. But I took this on because I feel very strongly about these issues. I think these are misguided legislative proposals, which, if they were enacted, became law, would hurt the U.S. economy and the American people. And I strongly believe that. And my approach is I don't think about the politics. I don't do the politics. I'm just going to state the facts as I see them and see where that takes us. The third one. Wow, I have bad handwriting. What was the third question?
When was the onset of this calling for more oversight into the process of the Federal Reserve?
So I would steer you to early American history, actually. Seriously, it's fascinating. There has been, and I would call it pretty healthy, actually, there's been skepticism of centralized institutions in the United States, which I share, and since the beginning of the Republic, really. So there have been a couple of attempts to start a central bank, and this one was started in, 1913, after the Panic of 1907. The history is very interesting, and appropriately, in fact, the whole structure of the Federal Reserve System represents a compromise between the, if you will, the East Coast and the rest of the country. So there's a board of governors in Washington. Everyone's nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, with long terms. But the Reserve Bank presidents also vote on monetary policy. They're not nominated by the president or confirmed, and they bring diversity of views on monetary policy to the table. And I frankly think it's very healthy to have them come into town every 8 weeks and have a very different set of views. It jars the system in a way that I think goes some distance toward avoiding groupthink. So I personally think it's quite a healthy balance. But so today's pushback is really, part of a long line of skepticism, appropriately so, about central institutions in the United States. I think it's heavily based on a misunderstanding of what we do, though, and I think it's misguided, as I said, and I feel so very strongly. I got time for one more round, if that's okay.
Yes, sir. Hi, how are you? I'm Katsuli Zumo, a student, Catholic University, and I just want to ask, what are the factors of this simple equation you keep referring to for the monetary policy that comes out, that goes to the Congress?
Good question. Okay, so there, three, yeah.
Back.
And then get the guy with the tie here, too.
Hi, I'm Chris Goins with the American Spectator, and I just wanted to know, what do you say to critics who say the Federal Reserve caused booms and busts, the recession cycle? Because there are some who say, hey, you know, when the Fed lowers interest rates, people tend to buy things that they wouldn't usually buy and invest things, and you know, there's a misdirection of resources and things like that in the labor. What do you say to those critics?
Okay, one more. This gentleman.
Norman Singleton, Vice President of Policy for Campaign for Liberty and previous Legislative Director for Congressman Ron Paul. My question is, where in the specific language of the Audit the Fed bill do you see anything that gives Congress any new authority other than the ability to gain more information about the Federal Reserve that would at all compromise their, as you already pointed out, already historically compromised independence? And what does it say about our monetary system if the people who run it believe that it is so weak that transparency will somehow damage it?
Okay, first to the Taylor rule. Who you did? So the three factors, it's really a three-factor equation, and they make perfect common sense. It's kind of a reflection of the dual mandate, frankly. So the first one is just what's thought to be a after inflation neutral rate, which it's just really the number two. Think of it as the number two, and that's the real rate that would bring the economy back to full employment and prices at equilibrium. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is just the difference between how much output we have and how much we could have. So we know how much we have a way of measuring how much output we make every year, that's GDP, but there's something called potential GDP, which is sort of full employment GDP. So I'll stop there for a second before I get to the third term. The issue there is that we really don't estimate full GDP very accurately at all. It's very much like trying to predict the weather in 14 days. So the science isn't there. So 10 years later, economists will re-estimate and say, oh, the estimate now of potential output, in fact, it was much lower, and that's why you had inflation. So it's a moving variable. By the way, also that first term, the number two that I gave you, that clearly moves through the cycle, so it doesn't stand still. The third one is just the difference between the inflation goal and realized inflation. So what you do is you just take the number two and you add, you multiply half times the output gap and half times the inflation gap, and it gives you a number which says what policy should be. That's the original Taylor rule, authored by John Taylor, a great American economist. It's a huge contribution to monetary policy. If you go back and read his original article, University of Rochester article, he says very clearly this could never be used as a mechanical guide for monetary policy. But it has been a very successful innovation. We look at 6 or 7 different kinds of policy rules like that, which help you think about about policy. So that's really how the rule works. And again, I wouldn't, obviously I do think it's a useful thing and a great contribution. It's just, it's in that second bill I described, it's just applied in a mechanical way that has almost no support in the economics profession. Question number 2. Oh, yeah, so great question. The question is, do we cause booms? And I guess I would really look at that question this way. What would life be like without the Fed? In other words, I wouldn't expect perfection from any government organization or any organization of any kind. So the Fed will never get things perfect, and the Fed has made mistakes, right? We allowed inflation to get out of control in the 70s. Policy improves over time, we hope. Exogenous events happen, and they make fools of everybody, and then they'll make geniuses out of everybody. So don't expect perfection. But over time, it has made sense. I think the Fed has done a good and an improving job in keeping inflation low now for more than 30 years, and essentially having pretty good results. Now you ought to be pointing to the financial crisis and say, how did that work out? So the financial crisis is not something that any government agency that had a responsibility for the economy can really feel good about. So mistakes get made. But I guess the question I would ask back is, what would life be like with if you look back pre-Fed, there were very severe depressions that looked a lot more like the Great Depression. In this depression, output went down 4%. In the Great Depression, output went down 25%. So, that kind of thing happened a lot in the 19th century. You had these hard stops of credit. The banking system would fail to be a run on the banks. J.P. Morgan personally would come in and get his friends together and bail out the system. So the judgment was finally made to create a central bank. There is no advanced economy in the world that doesn't have a central bank that does pretty much the same thing the Fed does. No one has run an experiment in a very long time of not having a central bank. Don't really think that's the way to go. So you asked about the language, and you know it does exactly what my statement said. I think I described it pretty precisely. So what it does is it repeals the GAO exemption, and what that does is Congress has the authority to do that. Congress created the GAO exemption. What it does is it gives Congress a tool to jump in and get involved in monetary policy on a meeting-by-meeting basis when Congress doesn't agree with monetary policy. Congress didn't have to create the Fed. Congress could make monetary policy. It could be done by a subcommittee of the House Banking Committee if Congress wants. They didn't do that. They gave it to the Fed. Long research shows that it'll be better. Policy will be better if Congress doesn't get involved in monetary policy. The transparency argument is completely empty. There is nothing other than literally having TV cameras in the Fed boardroom that would be advanced in terms of transparency. So I don't buy it at transparency. I think it's, as someone said, a stepping stone to abolishing the Fed.
All right, please join me in thanking Governor Powell.